Այսուհետ մեր հեռուստաընկերության ծրագիրը հնարավորություն ունեք դիտելու նաև 44.10 ալիքով, իսկ դրա համար պահանջվում է ընդամենը ձեր հեռուստացույցին միացնել սովորական ալեհավաք և մեզ դիտել անվճար։ 44.10 ալիքը կարող եք դիտել Oxnard, Los Angeles, Riverside, Orange շրջաններում։ Հավելյալ տեղեկությունների համար կարող եք զանգահարել AMG-ի հեռուստաընկերություն 818 547 96 96 հեռախոսահամարով։
Բարերեգո սիրելի հայրենագիտներ, ինչպես ամեն շաբաթ երեգո կմիանանք ուղի եթերով, այսօր դիչարնագենք մեր հաղորդաշարը։ Նախքան խոսիմ այսօրվա նյութի մասին, կուզեմ շնորհակալություն հայտնել մեմիևս մեր սպոնսորներն Happy Eye Optical, ինչպես որ գտեսնակ TV վրա, շնորհակալություն կհայտնենք Happy Eye Optical-ն 114 East Wilson Avenue, Glendale, California, ուրեմն անոնք որ աչքի ակնոցի պետք ունեն, ովը մեկ ակնոցի պետք ունեն գրնան թիմել Happy Eye Optical-ին, հեռախոսի թիվը գտեսնակ TV-ի վրա մեմիևս, և երբ իմանունս կուտակ կստանակ զեղջ եղած կինով ակնոցներ ուրեմն։ Երկրորդը, ինչպես որ գտեսնակ Law Offices of A.A.C.O Պալթայան, ովը մեկ Criminally Immigration-ի, ովը մեկ հարցերով գրնակ թիմել A.A.C.O Պալթայանին, ինչպես որ գտեսնակ 330 Arden Avenue Suite 210, և գտեսնակ իրեն հեռախոսի թիվը։ Եվ երրորդը շնորհակալություն կհայտնենք Փոլանդի ժամանակին, որ մեզ մոտավորապես 1 տարի է սպոնսոր կհայտնենք։ Ուրեմն, որովհետև այսօր մեր նյութը անգլերենով ավելի պիտի լա եւ անգլերեն լեզվով պիտի բացատրենք շատ կարևոր անձնավորությամբ հետ պիտի խոսվի, նախքան անցնեմ այդ ինտերվյուին, ես մեմիևս պիտի հայտարարություն հայտնեմ թուրքական տեսփանարան արչև գա ցույցը Մարդի 9-ին ժամը 12:02, Մարդի 9-ին 12:02, ուրեմն հույն հայ ասորիան genocide-ներու վերաբերյալ Մարդի 9-ին 12:02 ժամը Իրաքի օրը թուրքական տեսփանարան արչև, ուրեմն ադրեսն է 6300 Wilshire Boulevard, Los Angeles, California 90048, կարևոր է որ բոլորդ այդտեղը ներկայալաք այդ ցույցին։ Ուրեմն այսօրվա մեր հյուրն է, ինչպես որ քիչ առաջ ըսի անգլերենով Mark Dankof-ը, առաջ որ անցնեմ Mark Dankof-ին վիդեոը պիտի ցույց տայինք, ուզեմ այդ վիդեոն ցույց տանք առաջ եւ անցնենք մեր այսօրվա ինտերվյուին։ Ինչպես կտեսնակ, Արևմտյան Հայաստանի citizen-ները կպատրաստվին, շատ շուտով պիտի ստանա ամեն մարդ իր citizenship-ը, մեր Հայաստանը, Արևմտյան Հայաստանի և ամբողջական Հայաստանը ազատագրված հավասիկ citizen-ներու գարկը, որ արդեն թիմած են և լուծումը պատրաստված է և կան հայորավոր, որոնք թեր կպատրաստվին և բոլորիդ կարաշարգենք մաս կազմենք այս հաղթության։ Ավասիկ կվերաթարնանք, ուրեմն հիմա պիտի անցնենք մեր հաղորդաշարին եւ վերջի 5 վայրկյանը պիտի խոսենք Արևմտյան Հայաստանի արձանագրության վերաբերյալ։ Անգլերենով բիլ այսօրվա հաղորդումը պիտի փորձեմ մի քանի խոսքով հայերենով թարգմանել, եթե կարելի է։ First of all, I would like to thank you, Mark Dankof, for being on our show one more time, taking our invitation to talk about those very important geopolitics that is going on around the world, the political situations that is in danger, the whole world is in danger. As we see, Russia, Ukraine, United States, Syria, Turkey, everything is basically chaotic as we speak. And we want to discuss with you what we as people that live in the United States, what should we do to prepare for the upcoming revolts. Thank you very much one more time for Mark being on our show.
Always good to hear, and there's so much to talk about tonight, and as you correctly described the situation, Bedros, it is truly chaotic and truly dangerous.
And I would like to start from, first of all, let's start from the first boiling pot that is going on right now, which is Ukraine. We know there's a revolution going on within, and we know all the threats that is taking place from United States, from Russia, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit what this situation has to do with the current issue of Syria that has been taking place.
Well, I think in both situations what you have is the United States in conjunction with this Jewish neoconservative movement that's clearly operating on behalf of the Zionist state of Israel and the international banking community, is intervening in both Syria and in the Ukraine with disastrous results in both. Just take a look at the Ukraine, for example. Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, who is clearly involved in this situation in the Ukraine, was quoted the other day talking to the United States ambassador to the Ukraine in terms that made it very, very clear that the American government believes that it can do anything that it wants in Ukraine, that it can choose the people to support, that it can pull the rug out from under any government that it so chooses, and that the rest of the world is supposed to simply sit by and allow this to happen. Victoria Nuland is married to Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan is a name that should resonate with anyone who has studied the Jewish neoconservative movement in America, because he links up again with this not so shadowy network of Zionists and neoconservatives that are clearly operating in the interest of the New World Order. Again, when you search Robert Kagan's name out, you will see that he links up quite nicely with all of the major players that have been involved in the project for the new American century, and that have been involved in all of the organs of opinion and the think tanks and the agents of influence that clearly are under the direction of globalism and the Zionist lobby. So there's a lot that can be said about this in terms of the Ukraine, but Ukraine and in Syria, this is the element that is utilizing the United States government and allies of the United States to intervene in situations that are not only none of our business, but that will have blowback, that will have consequences that will be absolutely dreadful, not simply for the entire world and for the countries where these things are going on, but the American public seems to be asleep at the switch and understanding how its own government is dragging us into circumstances that are going to lead to terrible loss of life, that are going to lead to economic catastrophe, and frankly, a worldwide hatred of the United States that is developing globally, chiefly because of our alliance with Israel, and because we are seen as the glue that holds together the globalist New World Order movement. And it's a very, very sad thing to watch.
But also, Mark, I would like to ask you, people in those areas have been complaining about the bureaucratical systems that they've been living under. Would you say this has a connection of to impose certain rule of law on people so they can revolt in the near future, and these forces that are revolting against are perpetrated by the New World Order, of course, but then they're using the situation of the poverty, basically?
Well, yes. I mean, I think you look either at Syria or at the Ukraine, just two examples, or at Egypt as a third, And we see that there are very, very definitely indigenous circumstances in each of these countries that have led to domestic discontent with various governments and various structures in these respective countries. This, however, sets the stage for outside intervention and interference, and for the pitting of Faction A against Faction B, and for outside interests to be involved in financing certain people and certain movements and certain political parties for their own purposes. So that is where I think we have a common thread with Egypt, Syria, and the Ukraine. Chris Ernesto's article today for antiwar.com, which I think is the featured story, says it quite well. Take a look, he says, at who the United States is supporting in the Ukraine, in Egypt, and in Syria, and the common thread in all three of these is good.
But the situation that is being controlled by right now the revolution, let's say the protesters, is being led by members of New World Order. What about the people? How will they face when so-called democracy takes place? What would you say to that? I mean, they're doing it for democracy apparently because they're tired of the system. But when they find out that this is not true democracy they've been looking for, what will be the end result?
Well, let's take a look at the Ukraine, for example. These people in the western part of Ukraine who have an orientation that is apparently Western-leaning, some of it pro-European Union. Clearly, this element was not at all happy with Yanukovych's decision not to accept this economic trade offer from the EU, but rather to go with the counteroffer that was made by Vladimir Putin of Russia.
Right.
That's when this unrest began, and it clearly found many supporters in the West with organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy and so forth that were manipulating this situation. The problem, as I see it, when you look at an article that it was written today in Pravda, LouRockwell.com reproduced it with permission. This woman, whose name I believe is Lyuba Lutko, was talking about this so-called poisoned loan that the EU is getting ready to make to the Ukraine. In fact, the EU is having so many of its own problems financially and with anti-EU dissent among many of its member countries that the EU really doesn't have a lot to offer the Ukraine, given the fact that it's been estimated that the Ukraine not only would need about $25 billion a year to even begin to survive because their cash coffers are virtually non-existent, but it's been suggested that with the lack of effective management infrastructure in that country, that you could see a need for upwards of about $200 billion a year that would need to be pumped into that economy to resurrect things at all. Clearly, the EU didn't have this. Clearly, the EU has it in mind that the International Monetary Fund is going to be the agency that steps in and starts throwing around some pretty big dollars in that country. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the EU, there are substantial numbers of anti-EU political parties and individuals that are out there. Le Pen in France is one example, that would be very, very unhappy if the European Union put in any significant resources or time or political expenditure in the Ukraine. And this may well backfire on the EU because their elections, the European Union Commission elections are coming up on May 25th. And what we might see is a situation where there will be, if this thing in the Ukraine gets too sticky for the European Union, the fanning of anti-EU flames among some of the member states. So they're in a very, very touchy situation. And again, this article that appeared in Pravda today that LouRockwell.com has reproduced gets into just how much of an economic basket case Western Ukraine really is. And I think that many of the people who have supported this insurrection against the Yanukovych regime may well regret that, because once things begin to settle down a little, it will be very apparent to them that among some of the individuals and movements that were responsible for pulling off this coup d'etat, that there is tremendous tension among some of these people themselves, and those people in turn, it's quite fascinating. They are, in many respects, the descendants of the 10 million Ukrainians who lost their lives because of the forced collectivist agricultural policies of the old Soviet Union in the early 1930s, 1932, 1933. So on the one hand, one can see why there might be a traditional anti-Russian suspicion going on there. But on the other hand, the Jewish character of the Bolshevik Revolution is very clear to anyone who studies the evidence. And I think that when these nationalists, Ukrainian nationalists, find out that they may have jettisoned someone in the way of Yakunovich, who was basically pro-Russian, but in turn they're signing off on something that is not nationalistic in orientation at all, but globalist. And when you start talking about globalism, the New World Order, the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, there lurks the specter of world Zionism. So this is the great paradox in this whole situation. And frankly, the European Union and particularly the United States may come to rue the day when they were so quick to fan the flames of this anti-Yakunovich movement that has resulted in what in fact may be an illegal and unconstitutional ouster of this man, because whatever one thinks of him, it is a matter of record that when he was elected in 2010, all observers to that election agreed in the international community that it was a fair election, that Yakunovich won it fair and square. And the fact of the matter is that this gang that has run him out of town is a gang that did not follow the Constitution of the Ukraine in the procedures that are stipulated there in regard to how one removes a prime minister. So that whether you're dealing with the 1996 Constitution of the Ukraine or the 2004 Constitution, and there's some dispute as to which of those constitutions is recently the one that should be governing that country, the fact of the matter is that the parliament did not get the 3/4 majority necessary to impeach Yakunovich. Neither was the Ukrainian judiciary consulted in this process, as the Constitution definitely prescribes. So, in effect, the United States and the EU and the IMF and all the usual suspects have signed off on something that, because of its ill character and because of the way in which it was done, may well cause them future heartache at having supported something that's about to blow up in their faces. And then, of course, when you add to that the Russian response with what's presently going on in the Crimea, it's quite obvious that Vladimir Putin is not bluffing, that Obama can say all the things he wants to say, and John Kerry can say all of the things that he wants to say, and some of these Union figures can be spouting off about democracy. The fact of the matter is, this isn't democracy. A man who was duly elected in a legitimate election was overthrown in a coup d'etat that had outside backing. And now that Vladimir Putin has decided that the people of the Crimea and eastern and southern Ukraine basically want some type of relationship with Russia and not the EU, Putin's prepared to do something about it, and Barack Obama had better watch his step.
I would say certainly there is something boiling in the region of Middle East, and right now we see Russian region, Eastern Europe, and around there. Something has been boiling very seriously, and I will explain. I will try to explain why I think in that model. We see what has been going on in Syria. They've been trying to exterminate, deport all Christians. Recently we heard Raqqa, which is controlled by Islamic jihadists, so-called people that revolted for democracy. Now it's under control of Sharia law, as we know. They came out with new regulations and rules for Christians. Every Christian should pay dues, gold, money to survive in Raqqa area, in Sharia law area, or they will be killed or they will be deported. Either one. Christians they're not supposed to wear crosses. Now we see the same situation, anti-Christian sentiment in the region of Ukraine. While the anti-Christian sentiment was in Turkey for the longest time, it never revived from Ottoman Empire, Kemalist time until Erdogan's time. Right now we see. So there is something boiling against Christian identity. What would you say on that?
Well, I think Pat Buchanan has been one of the people who's pointed out from the beginning that the Christians of Syria, some 2 million people, are very, very much definite supporters of President Assad, the Alawite Shia ruler of Syria, because he has always had a relationship with them that has basically been a live and let live type of relationship. It is not in any way, shape, or form the type of relation that will occur if these Sunni Wahhabic extremists should overthrow Assad and take over that country. The fact of the matter is that the Alawite Shia people recognize that there will be a bloodbath if these Sunni extremists take over that will not simply result in all this loss of life for Shia, but the Christians of Syria will be murdered, incarcerated, or run out of the country. This has already been going on. I think you were the one who pointed out to me, Bedros, that recently, what is the latest count? Something like 450 Christian murders in Syria that have been directly attributed to either al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda or someone affiliated with one of those two organizations.
The Iraqi Islamic that group, the new group that Asham they call, whatever they call, they've attacked from the side of Ras Al-Rain or Hasaka, and it's very interesting that they're not announcing on any TV, CNN, Fox News, even Syrian TV is not announcing it, but it's the inside news that they've killed 450 Christians in that region this week alone, just because they were Christians.
And it's very apparent why this would not be in the Western news media, and that is that it would draw people's attention to the fact that the United States government, which has, at the behest of Israel and Saudi Arabia, been very much involved in stirring the pot in Syria, very much involved in trying to overthrow the Assad regime, would be directly linked to these murders of these Christians, both the ones that have already taken place as well as the ones that may yet take place. And frankly, when you look at what has happened to the Christian population of Palestine, the Christian population of Iraq, and now the Christian population of Syria, there's a common thread running through all of these situations. None of this is an accident. And the fact of the matter is that when we look at U.S. foreign policy, it is absolutely, completely in tatters. And how in the world can we maintain this fiction that our ongoing presence in Afghanistan is directed at the threat of Al-Qaeda, when in fact we are utilizing Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra in Syria. We were utilizing these extremist elements in Libya. And one of the things that clearly has come forth in recent times is that whenever Benghazi is mentioned and the death of this American ambassador in Benghazi, Fox News and these other Zionist-controlled outlets conveniently omit the fact that this American ambassador who was killed, I believe his name was Walker, if I'm remembering correctly, was in fact directly linked to a gun-running operation where there were all kinds of weapons that had been taken away from the Gaddafi regime's cache of weapons after it was overthrown. And those weapons, with the full blessing and participation of the ambassador of the United States to Libya, were being transferred to these extremist elements in Syria. Right. We now have the evidence, of course, that the President of the United States has approved 2 installments of payments to these Syrian rebels that have totaled millions of dollars. I think the last cash shipment that the president made over there, according to antiwar.com, is something like $125 million. And when you look at the clear buildup of this American logistical post on the Jordanian-Syrian border, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what that's going to be used for. It's going to be a logistics outpost that's going to be transferring all kinds of weaponry to these Sunni extremists in Syria, at the same time that I'm sure your viewers will understand and remember that it's come out quite recently that the Saudi Arabians have been, in fact, brokering black market Chinese man-portable missiles. They have been brokering Russian anti-tank armaments to these Wahhabic extremists in Syria. The idea being, of course, that if you can use these man-portable weapons to shoot down aircraft, that will begin to neutralize the Assad regime's clear advantage in the air. The other thing, of course, is that these anti-armor weapons be very much designed to defeat the present advantage that President Assad's forces have with conventional tank armor. So this is obviously what's been going on. And when you think that the Saudi regime, with the full blessing and connivance of the United States and Israel, is transferring to the worst Sunni Wahhabic extremists imaginable these Chinese man-portable weapons that are used to shoot down not only military aircraft but civilian airliners, and then of course the Russian anti-tank armaments. It's obvious that the Assad regime has every reason to feel that it is completely under the gun, and frankly what has now been termed the failures of these Geneva II talks related to Syria are not surprising at all, because the present regime is basically being told that it must negotiate with a gun at its head, that President Assad must step down, that they will have no say in what kind of a government is put together in Syria thereafter. And then, of course, when the people that you're negotiating with are the people who are facilitating all of these foreign extremists and foreign imported extremists being in your country and getting all outside help with finances and with weaponry to destroy your country and to overthrow your government, this is a ridiculous situation, and people are getting tired, I think, of discovering that the United States government and this neoconservative element that's aligned with the New World Order, with the banks, and with the Zionist State of Israel is once again using the term democracy in a most Orwellian sense is an external justification for something that has nothing to do with democracy whatsoever, and that is to bring further power and further profit to the Netanyahu regime, to the international bankers, and to the armaments merchants, the so-called merchants of death. This is what's happening here. It's what's happening in the Ukraine. Then, of course, start looking at what it is that Chris Ernesto was talking about today, that the U.S. and its so-called National Endowment for Democracy are bankrolling in Egypt. It's a very, very ugly and sordid picture. It's demonic.
It's certainly, we can say that history repeats itself. It's very evident that it is repeating itself. World War I, prior to World War I, there were revolutions. For example, Ottoman Empire, people that were minorities oppressed, they revolted. Of course, the leading party at that time was Young Turks, which was a brutal, Zionistic, brutal genocidal regime. But most minorities believed in them and revolted alongside with them, unfortunately, because they wanted freedom. So my misunderstanding right now is even in those regimes, people are suffering, and that's why they're revolting. They're not revolting because they're seeking democracy all of a sudden, but they're revolting because of poverty, because of issues that they're facing from those imperialist extreme capitalist, let's put it, bureaucratical systems that have been controlling these areas too. What would you say on that part? Because we see that history is repeating itself. What happened at the beginning of 19th century?
Well, yes, and just as you had it at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, the fact of the matter is that communism, which is ultimately at its inception a Jewish movement, Zionism is a Jewish movement. Zionism and communism and collectivism have a great deal in common, by the way. That's one side of the Jewish coin. The other side is the multinational corporate capitalist system that we see today, which is also largely Jewish in origins, that has produced something arguably as evil ultimately as the old communist system has been, as the old communist ideology has been. The fact of the matter is the late evangelical Protestant theologian Francis Schaeffer of L'Abri was correct when he was asked in the 1970s what the difference is between communism and capitalism, meaning corporate capitalism. Schaeffer, with incredible prophetic insight, said, well, he said, with communism, he said, the communist argues that matter, meaning the physical realm, the physical world, matter is all that exists. There is nothing else other than this present physical realm. He said, multinational corporate capitalism basically believes that matter is all that matters. In other words, they don't officially deny the existence of God in the way that the communist, the way that the Marxist does, but in the way that the multinational corporate system works itself out and the way in which it has bequeathed untold amount of misery to untold numbers of people, up to and including what it's now beginning to do to the people of the United States. Again, these are two sides of a very, very evil coin. And so when we are looking at this tragedy, it is very, very clear that when people are suffering, when people are losing their livelihoods, when the economies and their cultures are being subverted and destroyed, they are ripe for listening to the first person or the first movement that comes along that sounds like it might have an instant solution, usually rooted in some form of revolutionary violence. But the fact of the matter is that the way the world game is played, so many of these people, so many of these movements are themselves being manipulated and financed by the hidden hand. So in fact, well-meaning people get involved in some things and don't understand the bigger picture and end up being tragically used for results that they did not intend. And I would contend that that's what is likely going to happen to these Ukrainian nationalists who were so vociferous and wanting to get rid of Yanukovych, only to discover, they haven't discovered it yet, but they will, that in the last analysis, this relationship with the European Union and the International Monetary Fund is not going to be a happy one, and it's going to result in subservience to and slavery to a system, an economic and political system that again will prove to be as reprehensible as the communist system was to their forefathers in the 1930s.
Absolutely, you're right on that. The other factor is Turkey, as we see. We've heard for the past year the revolts that have been taking in Turkey for different reasons. Now they're revolting again and they're asking Erdogan to resign. Of course, genocidal, I will name it the country that is author of many genocides, and the roots of the foundations of that country is genocide, built by genocidal Atatürk, who is highly recommended and respected by some of the Western countries, unfortunately. And as we see, they've killed millions and millions upon millions, and at the end they were respected by many Western countries. But the situation in Turkey is, again, it's about to break into revolts into different parts. And we Armenians have a land, big part of a land there that belongs to us. In your take, what do you think in this whole new maps that is taking place? Because Turkey has been involved in murdering people in Syria, especially Christians or Alawites. What is your take on Turkey right now?
Well, unfortunately, Turkey has served the interests of the New World Order quite nicely. I have a personal connection to Turkey only in that going back many, many years ago before I was born. My father in the 1950s was an American Air Force officer in Turkey. He was stationed in Ankara. And I would later, and years later, would hear various things from him about his experiences in that country at that time. The fact of the matter is, I would be the first to admit that my father, who was a good person, who was a great person, if you knew him personally, was nonetheless one who was highly naive when it came to buying American governmental propaganda, all kinds of things. And I think my father and mother basically believed that Ataturk was some great secular reformer who in effect was the father of modern Turkey. The fact of the matter is that I didn't learn anything in school, and I mean nothing, at any point in my education, grade school, junior high school, undergraduate college, or graduate school, about the Armenian genocide, Armenian Holocaust. It was simply something that was not referenced at all. And as I recall it, the first time I ever saw any reference to it in print was just in passing quite a number of years ago now in some Wall Street Journal op-ed that I was reading. And when I saw reference made to it and started doing just a little bit of research on it, I was utterly horrified to discover the fact that it was one of the most horrific developments, one of the most horrific events of the 20th century, and yet nothing is said about this today in so many circles, precisely because the present regime in Turkey is serving the larger interests of the New World Order. This involves NATO. This involves the International Monetary Fund. Despite what happened with the Israelis shooting up of the Mavi Marmara in international waters, which was a Turkish ship, and despite Erdogan's protests about that, frankly, it has not really disturbed too much, if at all, the ongoing clandestine working relationship between Turkey and Israel that goes on all the time, up to and including the Turks' involvement in this mess in Syria, which is clearly being done with Israeli blessing. So when you watch this whole thing, I would suspect that in terms of the Armenians ever seeing the return of their historic lands, the ones that I'm satisfied are in fact their lands, meaning the so-called Western Armenia, I certainly don't anticipate that the United States or the EU or the countries that we most often associate with the so-called New World Order are going to be at all happy to recognize that, even though, as you've pointed out, Bedros, and this is a significant thing to me historically, the Treaty of Severe, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
Was a treaty whereby President Woodrow Wilson, of all people, who is in many respects someone that I don't have a lot of regard for, frankly, but Woodrow Wilson's government recognized those lands as being Armenian lands and as defining the country of Armenia as the United States understood that when they recognized the terms of this treaty. I haven't heard anyone outside of you or the people that you're working with in this Armenian, Western Armenian governmental movement who has referenced this thing at all. The first I had ever heard of this treaty was through you, and again, I don't think that that's an accident.
Yes. Well, Mark, we're looking for Americans to be supportive of this government because it is our rights. We've talked about genocide for years and years, for 90 years, but our rights, we are the rightful owner of those lands. It was sealed, signed by the United States government. It was sealed and signed by many other governments, 18 governments, that were all present and agreed those lands belongs to Armenians. And unfortunately, during during the recognition, after the recognition, Atatürk and Lenin, the communist movement, they agreed with the Moscow Treaty, new treaty, in order to disregard what belongs to us. But now we are very much aware that what is taking place, and people, Armenians are waking up, and we want to return to our lands because we're living in United States in exile. We're here just because we're exiled. We have a land, and we have our own place that we're not able to move, since every other government supports those criminals that is called Turkey, unfortunately. And we are going to speak about it more in the American media very soon, and we want to make Americans aware of that the Armenian, the very first nation that Noah's Ark, even for the Christians, that they should know wherever it landed, it was Armenia. Garden of Eden was Armenia. So all those biblical places were Armenia, our lands. But unfortunately, history books or books that supposed to teach about the truth about the beginning of certain nations, they don't speak about it. Unfortunately, that's the situation. But coming back to Turkey, don't you think it is time that Turkey will be separated and divided, because it is built on genocides of Assyrians, Armenians, Greeks, and many other nations?
Well, you know, this is going to be an interesting thing to watch because it will transpire against the larger backdrop of the struggle between globalism and nationalism. You know, it seems to me that this is very little understood by many people today who, when they listen to Barack Obama and John Kerry talk about the national interest of the United States, have not yet figured out that what they're talking about as far as the national interest of the United States has little or nothing to do with the interest of the average American. They define the national interest of the United States as being that which is in effect fitting less than 1% of the total population of this country. The fact of the matter is that whether you're looking at the U.S. and the fact that since the Pat Buchanan presidential campaigns in the Republican Party in the 1990s, there has at least been a little bit of awakening of the American right, that the neoconservative Zionist hijacking of the American right after World War II has produced nothing of any positive benefit or gain for the average American patriot or conservative or Christian in this country. And along the same lines, it seems to me that we're seeing more evidence that in Europe, look at what's been going on with Greece, look at what has been going on with Hungary. Look, you know, when you look at places like that, at France with Marie Le Pen and the National Front and so forth, there is a renewed resurgence of nationalistic interest and nationalistic fervor in some of these countries, where the people of these countries have recognized that be they Hungarians, be they French men and women, you know, be they Greeks, that this European Union has in effect destroyed their economies, the integrity of political structures, their autonomy, and so forth and so on, and they don't like it. Now, it's in that climate that we could begin to see a breakup, conceivably, of Turkey, as there are a series of sectarian pressures that could be brought to bear on the regime in Turkey, up to and including the redressing of the situation with what happened to the Armenians in the first part of the 20th century, and the recognition on the part of the United States government and the other Western powers that signed this Treaty of Severe that, in fact, Armenia's land and Armenian borders are far, far more expansive than that little bit of real estate that we presently call Armenia. And you've cited something here that I think is very, very significant for people to note. and that is that when it comes to what happened to Armenia in the beginning of the 20th century, there you had, on the one hand, the Turk and the residual of the Ottoman Empire, and the anti-Christian thrust of many who were a part of the Ottoman Empire being visited upon the Armenians at the same time, that those people were in an alliance with Jewish Bolshevism to get rid of Armenians and to do it forcibly and violently and so forth and so on. This is interesting to me to watch because when you look today at what is happening to Christians in a place like Syria or Iraq or Egypt, the fact of the matter is that the Christians in those countries are caught in the crossfire of forces that many of them do not understand. So when you begin to see how this plays out, it'll be interesting to see just what kinds of political and economic strategy the Armenians can undertake that might enable them to gain a foothold in their historic lands far west of what they presently hold, and whether or not they'll be able to do it, and both in terms of creating a government in exile, which is of course the beginning of the issue, but then in regard to whatever it might take to forcibly reclaim those properties and to assert themselves in international law and to bring greater international attention to what has happened here, and to be in a position to fight back. That's going to be a very tall order, it seems to me, because presently with Turkey and their involvement with NATO and the way in which they serve globalist interest, at least up to this point, that would all be, I would think, directed against Armenians who want to reclaim their homeland.
Nevertheless, we are going to continue our struggle and fight, and with vision we can overcome all obstacles, I believe, and we can accomplish the rule of law, because justice is on our side. Well,
yes, and I think, as you and I have discussed off air before, I think what happened in Armenia in the first part of the 20th century is a microcosm of the coming persecution of the confessing Church of Christ worldwide. This is clearly going on in the United States with this Frankfurt School neo-Marxist cultural subversion that has taken place in our educational and governmental institutions and news media. It's clearly something that's going on where more Christian families are buckling under the pressure of trying to survive economically in circumstances where economic pressures virtually guarantee that families have to have both husbands and wives working for next to no money, and all the problems with the health care and everything else that goes with it. So this is where we are in this situation. And if I might mention something on air here that will be of interest to your viewers overseas, right here in the state of Texas, you have an African-American woman named Keisha Rogers who may well win the Texas Democratic primary Tuesday night for the U.S. Senate. If that, or would at least make the runoff for that nomination to face Republican John Cornyn in the fall. And Keisha Rogers is basically running against the banks. She's running against the IMF.
Yes, I've heard of her, yes.
And she's said things about Barack Obama that they came out of the Tea Party script. This suggests to me that there's something going on out there when you have an African-American woman in a place like Texas who is gaining this much support in the polls for starting to tell it like it is, at least on the subjects of the banks and Wall Street, and who it is that is fueling many, if not most, of our military commitments around the world that are going south.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, thank you for coming. Our time is almost up. I'm going to talk about a little bit about Western Armenia, the importance of becoming a citizen in Armenian language. But I would like to thank you very much for being on our show, and hopefully next time we can emphasize more on New World Order issues that we've been talking about it for the past 2-3 months at least.
Yes, and doing so in the context of biblical eschatology and prophecy, because I think both of us are agreed that that's very definitely the grid through which we need to understand all of this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Ayo gılısın siz. Ayo? Ayo gılısın siz. Ayo hırmetsek.
Bedros ջան, ես կարող եմ Մարկին հասկացել վերջացավ։
Գարձեմ ինքը վերջացավ, պիտի հիմա եթե կուզես ինքը քիզի վրա գրնա մնալ, շոյեն վերջերացանը գրնաս իրեն հարցնել։ Հիմա պիտի խոսենք քիչ Արևմտյան Հայաստանի հարցերով։ Շնորհակալություն։ Ուրեմն հիմա լսեցինք մենք անգլերեն լեզվով Mark Dankof-ին, շատ խելացի անալիստ է Միացյալ Նահանգներում մեջ Տեքսասի մեջ կապրի եւ իրեն վերլուծումները տվավ Mark Dankof-ին Press TV-ի վրա հաջող կրնակ տեսնել եթե ուզեք շատ եւ մի քանի անգամ մեծ ալիքներու վրա անալիստներ political analyst-ներ դվերժ եւ շատ հարկված անձնավորություն մնե եւ աբակային իրեն մասի շատ ավելի լավ բաներ գլսեք ես չեմ ուզեր հայտարարել բայց մի լսեք շատ ավելի լավ բաներ այս անձնավորության մասին որ մեզ հետ մի քանի անգամներ արդեն ինտերվյուներ ըրավ բայց հիմա մենք անցնենք անձնակիրներու մասին Արևմտյան Հայաստանի վտարանքի կառավարության ինչպես որ գտեստանք թարցումներ ինչ եթե գեհերևիկ լուրերը Ուկրաինայի մեջ Թուրքիայի մեջ Սուրիայի մեջ արդեն իրավիճակներ իրար խառնված ամենտեղ ժամանակ եկավ սիրելի հայրենագիտներ որ մենք արդյունանք մեր քնացած վիճակի մեջ են եւ անգլերենով ասեն reclaim-ն ենք, այսինքն դեր գաննենք այդ ինչ որ մեզ կպատկանի Հայաստանը, ամբողջական Հայաստանը, ոչ թե 29000 կիլոմետր, մեզ կպատկանի 162000 կիլոմետր եւ Գիլիկյան եւ մնացած մասերը։ Բայց հիմա գխոսենք որ այդ մասին որ մենք փաստաթուղթերով այսինքն ոչ թե մենք ամեն հայ այսինքն ոչ թե ես մենք որպես հայ զավակներ մենք փաստաթուղթերով ունենք փաստեր որ այդ հողերը մեզ կպատկանի եւ ժամանակը գա որ reclaim-ն ենք այսինքն իդ վերադարձնենք այդ հողերը մեզ եւ մեզ պատկանեն այդ հողերը եթե ոչ Միացյալ Նահանգներում մեջ Եվրոպայի մեջ տարբեր երկրներում պիտի assimilate անան եթե ոչ օլիգարխային համակարգներում մեջ ժողովուրդը պիտի փախին Հայաստանին ժամանակը եկավ որպես մենք հայրենիներ իրավահաջորդը այս Հայաստանին որ մեզ դրված է իրավունքը ցեղասպանության իրավահաջորդները բոլորս որ փախած են մեր մայրերը եւ հայրերը սպանված են ուրեմն մեզ գինա արցանակության բոլորս մասնակցին մեկ շունչով մեկ հոգով իմ խոսքը սպիտան բարոն Արմենյանին որ քիչ բացատրեմ
Bedros ջան նախ կամ բացատրել ես պիտի ուզեի բզդիկ անդրադարձում մնել Mark Dankof-ի մասին Պիտի խնդրեի ժողովուրդին, որ այսօր իրենց օրացույցներում, կալենդարներում վրա արձանագրեն Mark Dankof անունը, որում մասին ավակային 2016-ին պիտի իմանան այս մարդուն ըրած վերլուծումներու իսկական արժեքը Արևմտյան Հայաստանի կառավարության վերաբերյալ։ Կալով մեր Արևմտյան Հայաստանի կառավարության անցակիրներու մասին, այո մեծ աշխուժությամբ կշարունակվի, հոս մեկ կողմեն ես ուրախ եմ, որ շատ ժողովուրդ կտիմեն, նմանապես ուրախ եմ, որ շատեր գտնվեցին ու սկսեցին դրդնչալ, թե ինչու ուշացել է իրենց անսակիրները չեն ստացած, ուրախ եմ, որովհետև ատկան անհամբեր կսպասեն օր առաջ Արևմտյան Հայաստանի քաղաքացի դառնալ։ Սակայն առավել ևս ուրախ եմ, որ ես չեմ հասցներ ու ես փոքի առարգա կդառնամ, որովհետև շատ են թիմողներուն թիվը։ Ամենից որ պիտի խնդրեի բոլոր մեր հայ ազգայիններեն բոլոր նահանգներու մեջ, ըլլա Միացյալ Նահանգներու, ըլլա Հարավային Ամերիկայի, ըլլա Կանադայի, բոլոր նահանգներու ու քաղաքներու մեջ այն հայերը, որ գուզեն վոլոնտիր աշխատել, օգտակար տանալ այս զանգվածային համահայկական շարժումին, պիտի ուզեի, որ գապ պահեն մեզ հետ, որպես իրենց իրավասություններ դրվի ու գրասենյակներ, մասնաճյուղեր ու ենթամասնաճյուղեր ունենան բոլոր տարբեր քաղաքներու մեջ, որովհետեւ առավել աշխուժությամբ, առավել թյուրությամբ եւ առավել արագ ձևով գազագերբված ձևով ընթարաչենք այս լայնածավալ աշխատանքին, որովհետեւ այսօր սպյուրքի մեջ գաբրի մոտավորապես 10 միլիոն հայություն եւ 10 միլիոն հայության մեծավ մասամբ հետաքրքրված են ու թիմել ու դառնալ Արևմտյան Հայաստանի քաղաքացի։ Ադոր համար պիտի բանջեն բոլորեն որովհետեւ կապ բան մեզի հետ ովքեր որ ուզեն վոլոնտիր աշխատել այդ կապակցությամբ։
Ես գտնամ մեկ բան ավելցնել այստեղ։ Սիրելի արնագիստներ, ինչպես ամեն տարի մենք ցույցերու գելենք եւ դիմեն գնենք, ասենք որ ցեղասպանությունը ճանաչեք։ Ժամանակը եկավ կորզի ոչ թե տարին մեկ անգամ, ժամանակը եկավ կորզի, որ citizen դառնանք, քաղաքացի դառնանք այդ երկրին, որ մեզ մեկ հողցված է, Հայաստան, Արևմտյան Հայաստան, մենք արևմտահայեր ենք, որոնք դուրս տրված են մեր երկրեն, ժամանակը եկավ որ դիմեն դնենք, բարդատրենք, որովհետև փաստաթուղթերը կա։ Մեր իրավունքներու դերը կանգնենք այսինքն եւ ոչ թե միան ամեն տարի վստահենք մի քանի անձնավորություններու, որ մի երթանք այս ցույցին կամ այդ ցույցին եւ մեր հիշենք այդ օրը որպես ցավակցության օր եւ երթանք դուներնից մեր կորձովը սպառվին։ Ժամանակը եկա որ բոլորս արդեն տեսնակ 2010-ին որ խոսվեցավ փիլիսոփա Արայիկ Ստեփանյանի հետ Մոսկվայեն, այս խնդիրը բացատրեց այն ժամանակին, ինչպես պիտի Թուրքիան պիտի քանտրի եւ հավասիկ մեր աչքերուն արժեվ կտեսնանք որ այդ ջեոպոլիտիկական վերլուծումները որի գլա որ այսօր եւ հավասիկ մեմևս լսեք Մարկ Դենքոֆի խոսքերը մի քանի տարի վերջ ընդամենը հիշեցեք այս անձնավորության որ շատ խելացի անալիստ անձնավորությունն է ուրեմն բոլորից ժամանակ եկավ որ անդամակցենք քաղաքացի դառնանք հրամեցեք
այո ուզեմ խոսել
խոսեցեք հրամեցեք
Հայաստանի հարցով ուզեմ անդրադառնալ, որ մենք Սարդարավադի ու Արաքսի պատերազմի ժամանակ ապահովեցինք մեր բոլոր Արևմտյան Հայաստանը, բայց ճշմարտաբար 1925 թվականին սովետներու գավթի տաշտակերով գործընթացին։ Այսօր շատ դժվար գիտելա ադիգա իբրև տաշտակիր ստիպել, որ թուրքը հրաժարի։ Ուրեմն ինչ պիտի լա մեր ամբողջական աշխատանքը վերստանալու համար։ Մեր միակ պահանջը պիտի լա Ռուսիայեն, որ պահանջենք, որ այդ պետ սխալը գործեցին եւ մեր Արևմտյան Հայաստանը վերացածենք։
Շնորհակալություն։ Իսկ իմ կարծիքս Ռուսիային պահանջելու բան չունենք մենք պահանջելու բան ունենք միջազգային թադարաններն եւ առավել պահանջելու բան ունենք Միացյալ Նահանգներն, որոնք իր նախագահ Ուիլսոնը ստորագրել եւ սեկրետարին սիլը դրած է։ Պահանջելու ունենք մեր փաստերը, այո։
Այո, թադավիճիրը մեր ցերկն է, մեզի կմնա ոչ թե ամեն տարի միան ցույց ընել ու դարի մոռանալ մեր նահատակները, մեր ցեղասպանությունը, միան հիշադակում ապրիլ 24-ին ոչ։ Կորսնական քայլեր առնելու ժամանակը եկած է արդեն մի քիչ էլ ուշ է։ Մեզի կմնա միան Արևմտյան Հայաստանի քաղաքացի դառնալ, հարցը բարձրացնել Միացյալ Ազգերու կազմակերպության թադավիճիրը մեր ցերկն է, պետք է ներկայացնենք բանջարներուն անցակիրները, որովհետեւ դիրանանք մեր իրավասություններուն։ Եվ այսօր առավել եւս փաստ մնե որ Թուրքիո մեջ գտնվող բոլոր մայնորիտիներ, փոքրամասնությունները, քյուրդեր, չերկեզներ, լեզգիններ, ավարներ, բոլորը այսօր կհամագործակցին Արևմտյան Հայաստանի վտարանտի կառավարության հետ։ Ինչու՞։ Շատ լավ իմանալով որ Թուրքիա բարակդումի բարակային դարաշներու պաշտպան ընթացքին Արուձի բաժինը բիդինա Արևմտյան Հայաստանի հայկական կառավարության։ Անոր համար հիմա գտնե իսկ փորձեն իսլամ փոքրամասնությունները լեզու գտնել Արևմտյան Հայաստանի վտարանտի կառավարության հետ, որովհետև հայտնի է լալիք պաշտամունքները աբակային։
Ուրեմն, որովհետև մեր ժամանակը վերջացավ, ես պիտի խնդրեի, որ այդ վիդեոը, որ մենք սկսանք այդ վիդեոը վերջացնենք, մինչև քարշապատ, անոնք որ հարցում ունին գրնան հարցնել, շոյեն վերջ մենք հոստերը պիտի սպասենք ձեր հեռացայիններում, մինչև քարշապատ ասված ցես հետ։ Ինչպես կտեսնակ, Արևմտյան Հայաստանի citizen-ները կպատրաստվին շատ շուտով պիտի ստանա ամեն մարդ իր citizenship-ը մեր Հայաստանը Արևմտյան Հայաստանի եւ ամբողջական Հայաստանը ազատագրված հավասիկ citizen-ներու գարկը, որ արդեն թիմած են եւ եւ լուծումը գուկա պատրաստված է եւ կան 100-ավոր, որոնք թեր կպատրաստվին եւ բոլորիդ կարաշարգենք մաս կազմենք այս հաղթության